Hi, my name is Carlene Scipio, and welcome to our brand new TV series called From Our Perspective. From Our Perspective looks at the lives and behaviors of millennials, Generation Z, and the changes that are happening in our 21st century and the innovators that are making it happen. We will explore trends, technology, music, fashion, social media, business, science, the arts, faith, and lifestyle, and we will do so through the eyes of various generations. We would look at their interests. How are they changing our 21st century? What is innovation, and what role does innovation play in our lives today? Who are our innovators, and what is causing market disruptions, and what does that mean? What are the differences and similarities between Generation Z, millennials, and other generations? And can these generations successfully coexist? We will talk to visionaries, movers and shakers who are doing great things in our local community and around the world. From Our Perspective is not just another talk show. There will be roving reporters from the Caribbean, Europe, and North America. This will be a show of learning, exploring, questioning, listening, and creative ideas. So come join us on Comcast, Verizon, and online.
Invention. Innovation. Without a doubt, the 21st century has brought with it many changes. From the camera phone in 2000, social media in 2004 and 2005, and the iPhone in 2007, the ability to access information and create one's own unique content is attainable. In our present-day lives, we've seen the power of social media to bring attention to injustices such as racism, sexism, and crime. The ability for a small voice to be heard by many can occur at the tip of one's fingertip. But as with everything in life, to fully understand where we are and what brought us here, we must look at our past. What blazed the foundation for 21st century inventions, and how has this shaped our lives, then and now?
Well, my name is Brian Belanger. I am the curator here at the National Capital Radio and Television Museum. I have a degree in electrical engineering, and to tell my story, I would have to start back when I was a child. I had a natural sense of curiosity about things, and I remember one day I asked my mother and dad, how does a radio work? We had a big floor model radio in the living room that the family listened to. Of course, that was in the days before television. So my parents didn't know how a radio worked, and their usual answer was, well, if you're curious about something, go to the library and get a book about it. Of course, we didn't have the internet in those days, so you just couldn't Google a question. You had to go to the library and get a book. I got a book on radio, started reading it, found it was really fascinating, got more books, and the more I read about it, the more interesting it got. So that's why I ended up majoring in electrical engineering in college. Now, that was an entirely different era, certainly much less diversity. The school I went to, Caltech, at the time there were no women undergraduates, no people of color. So it was certainly not a cultural environment where there was any diversity. But it was a wonderful experience, a very interesting experience. So I am thankful that I decided to major in electrical engineering. It's been a very interesting career, one that I've certainly enjoyed. I ended up going on to graduate school. I hadn't really planned on doing that. Nobody in my family had ever majored in anything technical, except I had a grandfather who was an electrician. But when I finished my undergraduate years, one of my friends said, why don't you go on and get a master's degree, because if you wanted to get a good job. You might have a better chance of getting a good job in a management position if you had a master's degree. So I went on to get a master's degree and ended up staying to get a PhD, which worked out very well because it gave me certainly many opportunities. It was, as I said, not something I had planned on doing, but it was certainly a very good experience. I think there are several elements that drive innovation. The first, I think, is curiosity. If you're very curious about how something works or why it doesn't work, that's a very important element of it. My career in electrical engineering really got started because I was curious about how a radio worked. I wanted to understand how a radio worked. And in those days, I think people took apart things more. A lot of kids would like to, in my case, I took apart old radios to try to understand how they worked, and that was, I think, an important part of it. Another important thing is to understand what came before, because if you're going to do something new and different, you really need to have the background of what all of the technology was that came before that. And then I think the other thing is to challenge the conventional wisdom. A good example of that is our friend Marconi, who was the first person to have a radio system that was able to send messages across the Atlantic. At the time, the conventional wisdom was that radio waves were like light from a flashlight or a laser beam that would travel in a straight line, and of course the Earth is curved, so there's no way that radio waves could travel around the curvature of the Earth. Well, at the time, nobody understood the ionosphere and how radio wave propagation works. So our friend Marconi, rather than accept what everybody believed, said, let's do some experiments. He put a radio system on board a ship and started off across the ocean to see how far it could reach. And of course, he discovered that it was possible to send radio messages across the Atlantic. So I think that's an important part of it. Challenge the conventional wisdom, learn as much as you can about all of the technology that came before, and have that sense of curiosity. Here in this museum we have an interesting example of an early television set. Underneath this plastic is what's called a scanning disc television set from 1931. At that time, people had not developed picture tubes to create the image, so they had to use a mechanical spinning disc to actually create the moving picture. But that turned out to be not a very good way of doing it, so then people had to abandon that and started working on picture tubes, so that by the late 1930s they had discovered a much better way of doing it. And that's one of the key things in technology is you never are satisfied with what the current state of the art is. You're always looking for ways to make things better. One of the interesting questions I've been asked is, what is the greatest invention of the 20th century or the 21st century? And I think the answer to both of those is the internet, which got started in the 20th century but has really developed in the 21st century. The reason I say that is because it allows so much knowledge to be demonstrated, to be disseminated so widely. Thanks to the internet, people anywhere in the world, in underdeveloped countries, have access to such a wealth of information. And I think it's really revolutionized society. There are some positive things about it. There are, of course, some negative things with concerns about privacy and social media. But still, it's a wonderful way of disseminating knowledge, because today, if you have a question about something, you can Google the question and find information that would have taken a great deal of effort to uncover in other times. I may be prejudiced because, of course, these are things that interest me greatly, but I think radio, television, and computers are an extremely important part of our society over the past 100 years or so. And really, all of them are intimately related. We would not have computers if it hadn't been for radio and television. We wouldn't have television if it hadn't been for radio. So I think those are particularly important to today's society. So here at the museum, we have a display of some of the different kinds of parts that have been used over the years. When radio first began, these things called vacuum tubes were what made it work. You had the ability to amplify weak radio signals using vacuum tubes. And so that was critical to the development of radio. And then when television came along, you wouldn't have had television if it hadn't been for the vacuum tubes that made radio possible. And had it not been for the development of radio and television, you wouldn't have computers, because the earliest computers used vacuum tubes similar to the ones that have been used in radio. In fact, I'm old enough that the first computer I ever programmed was a vacuum tube computer, larger than the room that we're standing in. It was huge, had less power than the cell phone that I have now. So if you think about the development of technology, we started with radio, developed these vacuum tubes that made radio possible. Then in the 1950s, we came up with transistors. Here are some examples of early transistors. So these little tiny transistors then took the place of the much larger vacuum tubes. They're much lighter weight, use less electricity. And then the vacuum tube, or the transistors then gave rise to integrated circuits. By making the transistors extremely small, we could combine multiple ones into a little plastic package that had so much power compared to what came before. And then the integrated circuits led to microprocessors. So today, with a modern microprocessor, you can have hundreds of millions of transistors in one little tiny package that allow us to do amazing things. But the point is, we would not have had television had it not been for radio. We would not have computers had it not been for radio and television. So there's a steady progression down through the years that's led to where we have today. And of course, the remarkable thing is how small things can be made today. I have a car key, and my car key has a little push button, so I can push that button and the car door opens. Well, that's because there's a radio transmitter in my car key, a little tiny radio transmitter that sends out a signal to the car, and the door opens. Now, that could have been done back in the 1950s, except the little box that had the push button on it would have been huge and so heavy you could hardly lift it, whereas today it fits in my car key. So that's an example of the remarkable progress in technology that we've had. We would not have the internet today had it not been for all the radio and technology that led up to the ability to do that with modern computer technology. The room that we're in now is our 1920s room here at the museum. Here we have radios of the kind that people would have had in their living rooms in the early 20s, and that's the decade when radio really got started for entertainment purposes. Now today, of course, we're used to having radios and televisions and smartphones and all this wonderful electronic technology. But we have to imagine what it was like in the 1920s when this was all brand new. It was like a miracle. I remember my mother and father telling me about the first time they ever heard a radio. People couldn't believe it, that you could sit in your living room, you could hear music coming in from some faraway city. Truly amazing. So these early radios were complicated to operate. One like the one we have in this display case here had 3 big knobs to adjust to bring in the station. So it was a lot of trial and error just to be able to tune in your radio. None of these radios had a built-in antenna. You had to climb up on your roof and string a wire out to a tree or out to the barn in order to be able to pick up any stations. Also, none of them just plugged into the wall socket. These early radios required special batteries, an A battery, a B battery, and a C battery. So it was not exactly a user-friendly thing, yet people got a tremendous enjoyment about having a radio in the living room and being able to listen to all of this entertainment. We have some examples, recorded examples of the kinds of things that people would have heard on their radios, and of course, today we all have music on our smartphones and we have music on our radios and our television sets. But of course today's music is very different from the music of that era. Let me play a little bit of music from the early 1920s. This is a dance band from station WDAF in Kansas City called the Nighthawks Orchestra. So that's the kind of music you would have heard if you had owned a radio in the early 1920s. Another point that I'll make in this room is that the technology was advancing very rapidly during the 1920s. And there are a lot of parallels between the growth of radio in the 1920s and the growth of the internet in recent years. I can remember not very long ago, people said to me, "Brian, someday you're going to have a computer in your home." And at the time I thought that was the craziest thing I'd ever heard, because at the time computers were gigantic and were used for data processing, and I couldn't imagine how I could ever make use of a computer in my home. And of course today I have 3 computers in my home. But if you think about that development of technology, at the beginning of the 1920s, the radios were very user-unfriendly. They were expensive, difficult to use, and that's the way it was in the early days of computers. Computers where you had to be kind of a geek to be able to use a computer in the early days. Today they're much more user-friendly. And it wasn't very long ago that very few people had even heard of the internet, and today, of course, we're all using it regularly. And that's the way it was with radio. In the early 1920s, most families couldn't imagine that they would someday have a radio in their living room, and yet probably 10 years later, most families had a radio. So there are a lot of parallels between the internet's growth and the growth of radio. Today, most of us have smartphones with our favorite music on the smartphone, so wherever you go, you have your music with you. This is a 1928 RCA Victor radio phonograph. Let me play it for you, you can hear what it sounds like. So this was a very expensive machine. This cost about the same price as an automobile back in 1928. But of course people wanted to have their favorite music available. And if we come over here, there's something even more interesting. This is what we call our 1920s boombox. It's a portable radio from 1924. You can see the carrying handle on top. And so you could take your music with you in 1924 if you had a strong arm. This is as heavy as carrying a very heavy suitcase around with you. And in spite of that, people carried them around. Here's a fellow who took his girlfriend to the beach. Look at the size of the radio that he had to take with him. So we can be thankful that today you have your favorite music on your smartphone, which fits in your pocket and is certainly not as heavy as carrying a suitcase around with you. In the early 1920s, radio cabinets tended to be very plain, mostly just kind of plain rectangular wood boxes. But as we got into the later 1920s, people put more and more emphasis on radio cabinet design. The thinking was, if you're going to have your living room with a great big radio filling up part of your living room, it should look nice in addition to sounding good. And so people began to pay attention to cabinet design. This is a very unusual combination radio phonograph unit in the shape of a little grand piano. If you open up the top, there's an 8 vacuum tube radio in the front here. And in the back is a phonograph. Here's a 78 RPM phonograph. So you might call it a home entertainment center from the 1920s. I mentioned in the previous room that in the 1920s, radios typically did not have built-in antennas to pick up the signal. So you had to climb up on the roof of your house and string a wire from the top of your roof out to a barn or out to a tree, run a lead-in wire down the side in order to pick up any signals. But what would happen if you lived in an apartment building? Your landlord might not mind if you had a radio, but might not want you to climb up on the roof to string wires. So in that case, you could buy what was called a loop antenna. We have several examples of those here. Now we're in the 1930s room, and I have a radio that I'd like to show you, which is a little out of the ordinary. This 1939 Philco radio is unusual because it has the world's first wireless remote control. Now today, our television sets almost always have a little remote control where you push the buttons on the little plastic thing and change channels on your TV set. This is the same idea from 1939, and this is the remote control unit. It's a box with a telephone dial on it. You had 8 different stations that were programmed to be run from the remote control. So right now, station number 6 is lit up, and if I put my finger in number 8 on the telephone dial and do that, the radio goes click, 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 changes to station number. Let me tell you the story of this famous dog. This dog's name is Nipper, and the story goes like this. There was an artist in England who had this little terrier dog. One day the artist had made a recording of his own voice, and whenever he played his recording of his own voice on the record player, the little dog would run over and put his nose down into the horn of the phonograph. The artist thought that was so cute that he painted this picture, and he titled it his master's voice. Well, here in the United States, there was the Victor Phonograph Company in New Jersey that saw that picture and loved it and paid quite a bit of money to the artist so that they could use it for their advertising. And so for the next, several decades, the Victor Phonograph Company used that picture and the motto, his master's voice, to advertise their phonographs. And then about 1930, the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, purchased the Victor Company and it became RCA Victor. And then for decades, RCA Victor used that for their advertising also. And so you might have seen a little dog like this one sitting on top of a radio or television set at an RCA Victor dealership. Or you might have seen a big dog like we have a large Nipper dog that would have greeted you when you came into the store. The question is, has modern technology made us better thinkers or creators than perhaps previous generations? My thinking on that is that people 100 years ago or 200 years ago were just as smart as we are today. But in some ways it's easier today because we have so much more information readily available. If you go back 100 years, the only way you could get information was to go to a library or to talk to people who were experts in that field. But in the days before rapid communication, it was not that easy to get in touch with an expert in the field. You might have to travel a long distance to do that. Today, if you have a question about any subject, you can Google it, you can find so much information readily available. So in some ways it's easier to be creative today. On the other hand, I don't think that people today are any smarter intrinsically than people would have been 100 years or 200 years ago. So certainly you can find wonderful examples of creativity in any generation. The next question has to do with what advice I might give to younger generations. I think my first suggestion is explore your curiosity. If there's something that you're interested in, pursue it with a passion. If you're going to make progress, you have to be working on something that you really care about, something that you find really interesting, something that you want to learn about, something that you're willing to spend a lot of time and effort on. So I think that's important. One difference today between young people today and young people, say when I was a kid, is that I think years ago there was much more hands-on experience. Say in the 1940s, if you were a kid growing up on the farm, you probably would have taken apart the tractor and put it back together again. When I first got interested in radio, I enjoyed taking apart an old radio just to see what was inside, try to help understand what made it work. Today that's more difficult. Nobody takes apart a smartphone today because, for one thing, the pieces are so small that you need a microscope to even see what's going on inside it. So I think there's probably not as much hands-on experience working with tools as there might have been years ago. But I think that's actually valuable experience. So I would encourage young people today to get some hands-on experience with taking apart things, putting them back together again. Another thing I would suggest is that there are plenty of organizations available to help. If you're interested in any particular field, you can certainly find clubs or organizations that have an interest in that. So get involved with other people who share your interest. Share stories, learn together, find mentors who can help you with it.
Hey, you.
Yeah, you. Getting that college education. What are you gonna do? Graduate and take some office job? Be like everybody else?
Or will you dare do something different?
Like, be a teacher. You could be my teacher. You got the skills.
The smarts?
Yes, you. You could be the teacher I never forget.
That'd be cool.
Does that corporate job even have recess? What are you gonna make of yourself?
What are you gonna make of me?
This is the moment I knew. His future had no boundaries.
There are some moments only the forest can inspire. Find yours at discovertheforest.org.